Good morning, Madam Chair, tribal leaders, distinguished government leaders, brothers and sisters. This statement is made by 96 indigenous nations and endorsed and supported by the National Congress of American Indians, which represent over 250 tribal nations in the United States. And also joining in this statement are over 20 indigenous organizations and coalitions. 7 years have passed since the General Assembly adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet the declaration is still having little impact on curbing the violations of indigenous peoples' human rights, which continue to occur worldwide. Indigenous peoples are being displaced from their lands and resources by mega projects and extractive industries. Indigenous women are still subjected to the worst forms and rates of violence with no access to justice. Indigenous lands and sacred places continue to be taken and desecrated with little regard for indigenous rights. Today, no country in the world openly opposes the UN Declaration, yet its words ring hollow when so little has been done by the United Nations or states to enforce its principles. We wish to see the conference take place in September 2014. We're not interested in seeing the conference postponed or canceled. Indigenous peoples cannot wait to achieve the promotion and protection of their rights. The process for taking action, however, must be open, transparent, democratic, and inclusive of all indigenous peoples' voices. Indigenous peoples, their governments, and representatives wish to see the United Nations take concrete and permanent measures that will at last provide meaningful improvements in the lives of indigenous peoples worldwide. The General Assembly has adopted the declaration, but real and sustained action to achieve its objectives is what is now needed. We therefore call on the United Nations to take action at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples by adopting several decisions. First, we recommend that the United Nations establish a body with the authority to promote compliance and monitor implementation of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The body must be empowered to receive relevant information, share best practices, make recommendations, and to work toward the objectives of the Declaration. The body should be made up of experts, including indigenous experts. This body would do more than anything to achieve the objectives of the Declaration and promote compliance with the Declaration. Second, we recommend that the United Nations take 3 steps to address the epidemic of violence against women. Convene a high-level conference to examine challenges to the safety and well-being of indigenous women and children, and to share perspectives and best practices on the realization of the rights of indigenous women and children under the UN Declaration. Require that the UN body for monitoring and implementing the Declaration give particular attention to the issue. And third, appoint a special rapporteur to focus on human rights issues of indigenous women and children, including violence against women and children, on changing state laws that discriminate against them. Third, we recommend that the United Nations take priority action at the earliest possible time to protect indigenous peoples' rights to their religious and cultural sites. We specifically recommend that the World Conference request the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council, the Expert Mechanism on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and a Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to gather and share relevant information and best practices from states and indigenous peoples. Conduct expert meetings and interactive panels, prepare studies, issue reports, and make concrete recommendations for the implementation of the rights of indigenous peoples. The recommended implementing and monitoring mechanism for the UN Declaration, when it is created, should also give priority attention to the protection of indigenous peoples' religious and cultural sites. Finally, we recommend that the United Nations take action to provide indigenous peoples and their representatives, especially their constitutional and customary governments, a distinct status for participating in United Nations meetings, processes, and events, a permanent and appropriate status that reflects their character as peoples and their authority as governments so that they do not have to call themselves NGOs or speak through civil society organizations. Our tribal nations are governments with long and proud histories. Our nations serve millions of people and own and manage millions of acres of land with vast amounts of cultural properties and natural resources. The practice of impairing or silencing by omission the voices of indigenous peoples, their governments and representatives, is not democratic and is not consistent with the objectives of the UN Declaration. The direct participation of indigenous governments and peoples is a real benefit to the UN, and their participation should be facilitated. Development of the details of these recommendations should, of course, have the full participation of indigenous peoples, their representatives, and governments. We wish to see the full and inclusive participation of indigenous peoples, their representatives, and governments in developing and helping to implement the decisions of the World Conference. We've already begun conversations with states about these recommendations, and we look forward to discussing them fully with as many state delegations and UN bodies as possible. Decisions by the World Conference that are in keeping with these recommendations will certainly achieve many of the objectives of the UN Declaration and ensure a productive and successful outcome of the World Conference. The full text of our recommendations is available online at indianlaw.org. We also have copies available in the room. Madam Chair, I thank you for this opportunity.